There are places in Texas where the earth remembers what men try to forget, where the soil holds secrets deeper than any grave, and where the line between the living and the dead becomes so thin that a man might cross it every night without ever knowing he has left the world of the waking behind. The land stretches out in all directions, endless and indifferent, a sea of brown grass and red dirt that swallows human ambition whole. The sky above is too big, too empty, pressing down with a weight that makes men feel small and temporary. At night, the stars are so numerous and so bright they seem close enough to touch, yet infinitely distant, cold points of light that have witnessed everything and remember nothing. The wind in Texas never truly stops. It moves across the prairie in waves, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage and something else, something older, something that smells like stone and time and the slow decay of everything. The wind makes sounds as it passes through the sparse vegetation, through the gaps in wooden structures, through the spaces between a man's thoughts. It whispers, it sighs. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, it speaks in voices that might be memories or might be prophecies or might be neither. Just the random collision of air molecules creating patterns that the human mind desperately tries to interpret as meaning. In the autumn of 1852, in a settlement so small it had no proper name, just a cluster of wooden structures huddled against the vastness of the Texas frontier, there lived a man named Ezekiel Marsh. The settlement existed in that precarious space between establishment and abandonment, neither fully committed to life nor ready to accept defeat. It was the kind of place people ended up rather than chose, a destination for those who were running from something or searching for something or simply too tired to keep moving. He was 37 years old, though he looked older, his face carved by wind and sun into something resembling the dried earth itself. Deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes, not laugh lines but lines of squinting against harsh light and harsher memories. His skin was the color of old leather, toughened by exposure, marked by small scars whose origins he could not or would not recall. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who had known hard labor since childhood. Fingers thick and strong but with a tremor that became visible when he held them still, a shaking that spoke of damage done to nerves or spirit or both. Ezekiel's eyes were gray, the color of overcast skies or old iron, and they held a quality that made people uncomfortable. Not because they were unkind or threatening, but because they seemed to be looking at something just beyond the visible world, focusing on a point slightly to the left or right of whatever they appeared to be observing. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice was rough as if his throat was lined with the same dust that covered everything else in this God-forsaken corner of Texas. He spoke slowly, carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man defusing a bomb, afraid that the wrong syllable might detonate something he could not control. He had come to Texas 5 years earlier, fleeing something he would not speak of, carrying with him only a shovel, a Bible, and a silence that sat in his chest like a stone. The shovel was well used, its wooden handle smooth from years of gripping, its blade nicked and scarred but still sharp, still capable of cutting through earth and root, and whatever else needed cutting. The Bible was a King James version, leather-bound, its pages thin and translucent, many of them marked with underlines and annotations in a hand that was not Ezekiel's, a feminine script that suggested the book had once belonged to someone else, someone who had read it with hope and devotion. The silence was the heaviest thing he carried, denser than lead, more solid than bone, a weight that increased with each passing year rather than diminishing. The settlement where Ezekiel lived consisted of perhaps 20 souls, most of them ranchers or farmers trying to coax life from land that seemed determined to remain barren. The buildings were constructed from whatever materials could be scavenged or afforded, mostly rough-cut lumber that had already begun to warp and split under the assault of sun and wind. The roofs were made of wooden shingles, many of them loose or missing, replaced with scraps of tin that rattled in the wind like distant thunder. The streets, if they could be called that, were just paths worn into the dirt by wagon wheels and boot heels, paths that turned to mud when it rained and to clouds of choking dust when it did not. There was a general store run by a widow named Sarah Hendricks, a woman of 40 with strong hands and a stronger will, whose husband had died of snakebite 3 years earlier, leaving her with a young son and a failing business she had somehow managed to revive through sheer determination and careful management. The store carried the essentials: flour, salt, coffee, nails, rope, ammunition, and a few luxury items that rarely sold: bolts of fabric that faded in the sunlight streaming through the windows, jars of preserves that grew dusty on their shelves, a music box that played a tinny waltz no one ever asked to hear. Sarah kept meticulous records in a ledger book, tracking every transaction, every debt, every credit, her neat handwriting a small act of civilization in a place that seemed designed to resist such things. There was a blacksmith named Tom Worthy, whose hands were perpetually black with soot, a massive man with shoulders like a bull and a surprisingly gentle manner, who could shoe a horse or mend a broken wheel rim or fashion a new tool from scrap metal with equal skill. His forge glowed red at all hours, and the sound of his hammer striking anvil was the heartbeat of the settlement, a rhythm that said life continued, work continued, people still needed things made and things fixed. Tom lived alone in a room behind his shop, sleeping on a cot surrounded by tools and unfinished projects, eating meals that Sarah Hendricks brought him, because he never remembered to feed himself. And there was a small church with no minister, just a building where people gathered on Sundays to sing hymns that were swallowed by the prairie wind before they could reach heaven. The church was the newest structure in the settlement, built 2 years earlier in a burst of optimistic community spirit that had since faded. It had a simple cross mounted above the door, fashioned from 2 pieces of timber bound with rope, and inside there were rough benches that held splinters for the unwary, and a lectern where various members of the community took turns reading scripture and offering whatever words of comfort or challenge they felt moved to share. The building smelled of fresh wood and old prayers, and sunlight came through gaps in the walls in dusty beams that looked almost holy. Ezekiel Marsh kept to himself. He worked odd jobs, digging wells, repairing fences, helping with harvests when the sparse crops permitted. He never asked for much payment, sometimes accepting food instead of money, sometimes working for nothing more than a nod of acknowledgement. He seemed to need the work more than the compensation, as if staying busy was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world of the living. He lived in a small shack at the edge of the settlement, a structure that leaned slightly to the east as if trying to escape the relentless western sun. The lean had developed over time, the result of poor foundations and high winds, and it gave the building an unsettling quality, as if it might topple over at any moment, as if it was perpetually in the process of falling. The shack had 1 room, a dirt floor that Ezekiel swept daily though it made no real difference, and a window covered with oiled paper that let in light but kept out clarity, turning the world outside into vague shapes and shadows. The paper was yellowed and brittle, torn in places, patched with bits of cloth. During the day, the interior of the shack was dim and close, heated by the sun until it felt like the inside of an oven. At night, it was cold, the thin walls providing little insulation against the prairie chill. Inside, Ezekiel kept his belongings to a minimum, arranged with a neatness that bordered on obsessive. A bedroll spread on the floor each night and rolled tight each morning. A tin plate and a tin cup, both dented and worn. A wooden crate that served as a table. The shovel, always within reach, leaning against the wall near the door. The Bible, kept wrapped in cloth to protect it from dust, placed on a small shelf Ezekiel had nailed to the wall at eye level. Nothing more. No decorations. No personal items beyond the absolute necessities. No photographs or letters or keepsakes. The shack felt less like a home and more like a temporary camp, a place to wait rather than a place to live. There was an emptiness to it that went beyond the lack of possessions, a quality that suggested Ezekiel had deliberately stripped away anything that might connect him to memories or feelings or the person he had once been. People in the settlement noticed things about Ezekiel Marsh. They noticed that his hands were always dirty, earth permanently embedded beneath his fingernails no matter how much he washed. They noticed that he never looked anyone directly in the eye, as if afraid of what he might see reflected there. They noticed that he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, though no one had ever seen him injured. But most of all, they noticed that every morning, just before dawn, Ezekiel Marsh emerged from his shack looking exhausted, his clothes covered in fresh dirt, his boots caked with mud, and his eyes holding a confusion so profound it bordered on terror. Sarah Hendricks was the first to speak of it openly. She mentioned it to Tom Worthy one afternoon in October, when the heat still clung to the land like a fever that would not break. She had seen Ezekiel that morning, stumbling from his shack at first light, looking as if he had been to hell and back. His shirt was torn, his hands were bleeding, and there was dirt in his hair, in his beard, under his nails, everywhere. Tom Worthy nodded slowly. He had seen it too. They all had. Every single morning, Ezekiel Marsh emerged from his shack looking like a man who had spent the night digging. But digging what? And where? His shack had no cellar. There was no construction happening nearby, no wells being dug, no graves that needed opening. Yet every morning, without fail, there was the evidence on his body, in his exhausted eyes, in the way he moved as if every muscle ached. Someone suggested asking him about it. But who would dare? Ezekiel Marsh was not an unkind man, but there was something about him that discouraged questions. A darkness that clung to him like a shadow that had learned to exist in daylight. So they watched, and they whispered, and they wondered. It was young Timothy Hendricks, Sarah's 12-year-old son, who first followed Ezekiel Marsh into the night. Timothy was a curious boy, the kind who could not resist a mystery, who picked at secrets the way other children picked at scabs. On a Thursday night in late October, when the moon was nearly full and the sky was clear enough to see God's plan written in stars, Timothy waited until his mother was asleep, then crept from their quarters above the general store and made his way to Ezekiel's shack. The settlement was silent. No dogs barked. No nightbirds called. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Timothy positioned himself behind a scrub oak about 50 yards from Ezekiel's shack, close enough to see but far enough to remain hidden. He wrapped himself in a blanket against the October chill and settled in to wait. Nothing happened for hours. The moon climbed higher, a pale disk that seemed to pulse with its own cold light, casting shadows that were sharp-edged and black as ink. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, constellations that had guided sailors and shepherds and wanderers for thousands of years, indifferent to the small drama unfolding below. The temperature dropped as the night deepened, the heat of the day radiating away into the vast emptiness above, and Timothy pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, his breath beginning to form small clouds in the air. He could hear the sounds of the prairie at night, sounds that were both familiar and alien. The rustle of small creatures moving through the grass, hunting or being hunted. The distant cry of a coyote, answered by another miles away. The creak of wood settling, expanding and contracting with the changing temperature. His own heartbeat, loud in his ears, a reminder that he was alive, that he was present, that he was about to witness something that would mark him forever. Timothy's eyes grew heavy. The monotony of watching nothing happen combined with the late hour and the rhythmic sounds of the night began to pull at his consciousness. He was beginning to think that perhaps tonight would be different, that perhaps Ezekiel Marsh would sleep like a normal man, that perhaps the strange compulsion that drove him to dig would somehow be broken or suspended just this once, when suddenly the door of the shack opened. Ezekiel emerged. But it was not the Ezekiel that Timothy knew. This man moved differently. He walked with purpose, without the usual hesitation, without the limp. He carried his shovel, the blade catching moonlight like a promise or a threat. His eyes were open, but Timothy could tell even from this distance that Ezekiel was not awake. He was walking in his sleep. Timothy watched as Ezekiel moved past the settlement, heading south into the open prairie. The boy followed, keeping his distance, moving as quietly as he could manage. The land was flat here, broken only by occasional rises, and the dark shapes of mesquite trees twisted into forms that looked like they were trying to spell out warnings. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, maybe half a mile from the settlement. Then Ezekiel stopped. There was nothing special about this spot, nothing to distinguish it from any other patch of Texas prairie. No marker, no stone, no cross, just earth and grass and the endless sky above. Ezekiel began to dig. Timothy crouched behind a mesquite and watched. Ezekiel dug with a rhythm that suggested he had done this many times before. The shovel bit into the earth. The dirt piled beside the growing hole. Ezekiel's face showed no emotion, no awareness. He dug like a machine, like something wound up and set into motion, incapable of stopping until its mechanism ran down. The hole grew deeper. Ezekiel disappeared into it, his head vanishing below ground level, then his shoulders. Timothy could hear the sound of the shovel scraping against earth, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to echo across the prairie despite the open space. Then the sound changed. Metal struck something solid. Ezekiel stopped digging. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Timothy heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was weeping. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from the grave, from Ezekiel in that hole. crying like a man whose heart was being torn from his chest. Timothy wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee back to the settlement, to his mother, to safety. But he could not move. He was rooted to the spot, trapped by the terrible intimacy of witnessing another man's anguish. The weeping continued for several minutes. Then it stopped. Ezekiel climbed from the hole. His face was streaked with tears and dirt. He stood at the edge of the grave he had dug, looking down into it, and Timothy saw his lips moving. He was speaking, but the words were too quiet for Timothy to hear. Then Ezekiel began to fill the hole back in. He worked with the same methodical rhythm, shoveling the displaced earth back into place, tamping it down, smoothing the surface. When he was finished, there was barely any sign that the ground had been disturbed. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would see the slight depression, the faint outline of a grave that had been opened and closed. Ezekiel stood there for a moment longer, swaying slightly. Then he turned and walked back toward the settlement. Timothy followed at a distance, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions he did not know how to ask. They reached the settlement. Ezekiel entered his shack. The door closed. Timothy waited for several more minutes, then crept back to his own bed, where he lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The next morning, Timothy told his mother everything. Sarah Hendricks listened with a growing sense of dread. She knew what Timothy was describing. She had heard stories like this before, in the old country, in Ireland where her grandmother had come from. Stories of people who walked in their sleep, who dug graves, who were compelled by forces they did not understand to perform rituals in the dark. The Irish called them the night walkers, and they said such people were cursed, marked by death, walking between worlds. Sarah decided that something had to be done. She gathered several of the settlement's residents that afternoon. Tom Worthy, the blacksmith, old Jacob Fuller, who had fought in the Mexican War, a rancher named Dutch Mackenzie, and Reverend Silas Kane, a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through and had agreed to stay for a few days to minister to the small congregation. They met in the back room of the general store. Sarah told them what Timothy had seen. Tom Worthy confirmed that he too had followed Ezekiel one night, though he had not gotten as close as the boy, and had seen essentially the same thing. A man digging a grave in the middle of nowhere, weeping over it, filling it in, and returning home with no memory of what he had done. Reverend Kane, a thin man with eyes like chips of flint, listened carefully. When Sarah finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that this was a matter of spiritual significance. He said that Ezekiel Marsh was clearly tormented by something, some sin or some trauma, that would not let him rest. He said they needed to confront Ezekiel, to bring this darkness into the light, to force him to face whatever demon was driving him to dig his own grave every night. Dutch Mackenzie disagreed. He said they should leave well enough alone. If a man wanted to walk in his sleep and dig holes, that was his business. It was not hurting anyone. But Reverend Kane insisted. He said that evil ignored was evil invited. He said that if they did not act, the darkness surrounding Ezekiel Marsh might spread, might infect others, might claim more souls. In the end, they decided to speak with Ezekiel. They would do it gently, with compassion, but they would do it. That evening, just before sunset, the group approached Ezekiel's shack. He was sitting outside on a wooden crate, mending a harness. He looked up as they approached, and something in his eyes told Sarah that he knew why they had come. Reverend Kane spoke first. He asked Ezekiel if he was aware of his nocturnal activities. Ezekiel's hands stopped moving. He stared at the Reverend for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. He said he did not know what they were talking about. The Reverend explained. He told Ezekiel about the nightly walks, the digging, the grave in the prairie. As the Reverend spoke, Ezekiel's face grew pale. His hands began to tremble. When the Reverend finished, Ezekiel stood up slowly, the harness falling from his lap to the dirt. He told them a story. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, the words coming slowly, painfully, like splinters being pulled from an old wound. He told them about Kansas, about 5 years ago, about a wife named Eleanor and a daughter named Grace who was 4 years old. He told them about the fever that had swept through their settlement, killing a dozen people in a week. He told them how Eleanor had fallen ill first, how he had nursed her for 3 days before she died in his arms, how Grace had become sick the very next day. Ezekiel's voice broke. He told them how he had buried Eleanor on a hillside overlooking a creek, how he had dug the grave himself because there was no one else to do it. Everyone was either sick or taking care of the sick. How he had lowered her body into the ground wrapped in their wedding quilt. How he had filled in the earth, patted it down, placed stones to mark the spot. How he had returned to their cabin to find Grace worse, burning with fever, calling for her mama. He told them how Grace had died that night, how he had held her tiny body until dawn, unable to accept that she was gone. How something in him had broken in a way that could never be repaired. He told them how he had carried Grace to the hillside, how he had begun to dig a grave beside Eleanor's. And then he told them the thing that haunted him, the thing that drove him from Kansas, the thing that pursued him even into Texas. He told them that as he was digging Grace's grave, he heard something, a sound from Eleanor's grave, a scratching, a scraping. He told them he convinced himself it was an animal, a prairie dog or a rabbit that had burrowed near the grave. But the sound continued, and then he heard something worse. He heard knocking. Knocking from beneath the earth. Knocking that came in a pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The same pattern Eleanor had used to knock on their cabin door when she came home from gathering water at the creek. Ezekiel stopped speaking. His whole body was shaking. Sarah Hendricks reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away. He continued his story. He told them how he had dropped the shovel and run to Eleanor's grave. How he had begun to dig with his bare hands, tearing at the earth, screaming her name. How he had uncovered the quilt, pulled it aside and found Eleanor's body exactly as he had left it. Dead, cold, not moving, not knocking, nothing. But he knew what he had heard. He knew. He had finished digging Grace's grave, had buried his daughter next to his wife, and then he had left Kansas that very day. He had walked away from everything, from his land, from his possessions, from his life. He had walked until he reached Texas. And even here, even hundreds of miles away from that hillside in Kansas, he could not escape. He told them that every night he dreamed of digging. In his dreams, he was always digging Eleanor's grave, always hearing those 3 knocks, always pulling away the earth to find her dead and still. And apparently, according to what they were telling him, those dreams were not dreams at all. He was actually walking out into the prairie and digging. Digging his own grave, he supposed, because he had buried himself that day in Kansas. He had buried the part of him that could live with what he had done. Because he had killed her. He had killed Eleanor. That was the truth he could not face. The truth that drove him to dig every night. She had not died of the fever. He had killed her. He had given her medicine, laudanum, to ease her suffering. But he had given her too much. He had miscalculated the dose. He had been so tired, so frightened, so desperate to stop her pain. And he had given her too much. She had fallen asleep and never woken up. He had murdered his wife. And then, consumed by guilt and grief, he had buried her too quickly, had not waited long enough to be sure she was truly dead. And she had woken up underground. She had woken up in her grave, and she had knocked. She had knocked, and by the time he dug her up, it was too late. She was already gone, suffocated in the earth he had piled on top of her. Ezekiel Marsh fell to his knees in the dirt outside his shack. He wept like a man being torn apart from the inside. The group stood in silence, none of them knowing what to say, none of them able to process the enormity of what they had just heard. Reverend Kane was the first to speak. He said that Ezekiel needed to confess his sins before God. He said that only through confession and repentance could Ezekiel find peace. But Ezekiel shook his head. He said he had confessed 1,000 times. He had prayed until his knees bled. He had begged God for forgiveness until his voice was raw. Nothing helped. Nothing could help. He was damned. He knew it. The nightly digging was his punishment, and it would continue until he died, and probably even after. Dutch Mackenzie said they should take Ezekiel to a doctor, to someone who understood diseases of the mind. But Ezekiel laughed bitterly. He said no doctor could cure what ailed him. This was not a disease of the mind. This was a disease of the soul. This was judgment. Tom Worthy suggested they watch over Ezekiel at night, that perhaps if they prevented him from leaving his shack, he might break the pattern. But Ezekiel said it would do no good. He had tried that himself in the early days. He had tied himself to his bed. He had locked himself in his room. Nothing worked. He always escaped somehow. The compulsion was too strong. Death itself was calling him to dig, and death would not be denied. The group left Ezekiel that evening with heavy hearts. There seemed to be nothing they could do. Reverend Kane promised to pray for him. Sarah Hendricks promised to bring him meals. But everyone knew these were empty gestures. Ezekiel Marsh was beyond their help. That night, Timothy Hendricks followed Ezekiel again. He wanted to understand. He wanted to see if knowing about the digging would change it somehow. Perhaps now that Ezekiel was aware, perhaps the pattern would break. But it did not. At midnight, Ezekiel emerged from his shack, walking in his sleep, carrying his shovel. He walked to the same spot on the prairie, about half a mile south of the settlement, and he began to dig. Timothy watched from his hiding place behind the mesquite. Ezekiel dug with the same methodical rhythm. The hole deepened. Ezekiel disappeared into it. The sound of metal striking earth filled the night. Then came the change. Tonight, Ezekiel did not weep. Instead, Timothy heard him speaking. The words carried across the prairie, clear in the still night air. Ezekiel was saying Eleanor's name, over and over. Eleanor, 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 like a prayer or a summoning. And then Timothy heard something else. Another voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A woman's voice answering from somewhere in the earth, calling Ezekiel's name. Timothy's blood turned to ice. He wanted to run, but he could not move. He watched as Ezekiel climbed from the grave. But this time, Ezekiel did not climb out alone. Something was with him. Timothy could not see it clearly, but he could sense it. A presence. A shape made of shadow and earth and grief. It clung to Ezekiel as he stood at the edge of the grave. It whispered to him, and Ezekiel listened. Then Ezekiel began to fill in the grave, but as he worked, Timothy saw something that made him bite his lip to keep from crying out. The shadow was helping. The presence was also shoveling earth, moving in tandem with Ezekiel, its movements mirroring his. Two figures filling one grave. When they finished, they both stood at the filled-in site. They stood so close they were almost touching. Almost, but not quite. Then the shadow sank into the earth, disappearing like smoke being pulled down into the ground. Ezekiel swayed, steadied himself, and walked back toward the settlement. Timothy ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the door of his mother's quarters and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, trying to form words but unable to speak. The next morning, Timothy told his mother what he had seen. Sarah Hendricks went pale. She knew what this meant. The dead were not at rest. Eleanor was not at rest. She was bound to this earth, bound to Ezekiel, trapped between death and whatever comes after. And every night, she called to him. Every night he answered. Every night they performed this ritual together, this dance of the damned. Sarah told Reverend Kane. The Reverend said they needed to find the real grave in Kansas. They needed to ensure Eleanor was properly buried, with proper rites, with prayers and holy water. Only then might her spirit be freed. Only then might Ezekiel be released from this curse. But Ezekiel refused. When they approached him with this plan, he became agitated, almost violent. He said they would not disturb Eleanor's grave. He said she was at peace where she was. He said the problem was not her. It was him. He was the one who could not rest. He was the one who kept digging. Leave Eleanor alone, he begged them. Please, leave her alone, Reverend Kane insisted. He said the woman's spirit was clearly in torment. He said it was their Christian duty to help her find eternal rest. But Ezekiel would not be swayed. He told them to stay away from Kansas. He told them to stay away from him. He told them he would leave the settlement if they did not drop this matter. So they dropped it. They watched. They waited. And every night, Ezekiel Marsh walked out to the prairie and dug his grave. And every night the shadow of Eleanor walked with him. November came. The days grew shorter. The nights grew colder. Ezekiel became thinner, more gaunt. The nightly digging was taking a physical toll. His hands were covered in permanent calluses and scars. His back was bent. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull. He looked like a man being slowly eaten from the inside. Sarah Hendricks brought him food, but he barely ate. She brought him medicine, but he refused it. She brought him company, but he sat in silence, staring at nothing, waiting for night to fall so he could perform his ritual again. On the 15th of November, something changed. That night, when Ezekiel went out to dig, Timothy Hendricks followed as he had been doing. But this time, when Ezekiel reached the spot on the prairie, he did not dig where he usually dug. Instead, he walked in a circle as if searching for something. He walked in wider and wider circles, his head cocked, as if listening for something beneath the earth. Then he stopped. He had found a new spot, about 20 yards from the usual location. He began to dig. Timothy watched from his hiding place. The hole grew deeper. Ezekiel's shovel bit into the earth with desperate urgency, moving faster than Timothy had ever seen. It was as if Ezekiel was racing against something, trying to reach something before time ran out. The hole was about 4 feet deep when Ezekiel's shovel struck something. The sound was different this time. Not the hollow thunk of wood, but something harder. Something that rang out in the night like a bell. Ezekiel dropped to his knees in the hole and began to clear away earth with his hands. Timothy crept closer, drawn by a horrible fascination. Ezekiel unearthed something. In the moonlight, Timothy could see what it was. A skull. Human. Yellowed with age. But not just old. Ancient. The bones around it were scattered, disconnected. These were old remains, far older than 5 years. These were not Eleanor's bones. Ezekiel lifted the skull. He held it in his hands, and Timothy saw tears streaming down his face. Ezekiel spoke to the skull. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he understood now. This was not about Eleanor. This had never been about Eleanor. He was digging up his own grave, not metaphorically, literally. This was where he would be buried. This was the spot his body would occupy in the earth. And beneath him, beneath where he would lie, there were others. The land remembered. The earth remembered. This spot on the prairie was a place of death, had always been a place of death. How many others had been buried here? How many others had their bones resting in this cursed ground? Ezekiel placed the skull gently at the edge of the hole. Then he climbed out. He stood at the edge of the grave and looked down into it. And he did something Timothy had never seen him do before. He smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has finally understood his fate and accepted it. Ezekiel lay down in the grave. He lay down on his back, staring up at the stars, his hands folded over his chest. And he waited. Timothy watched, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Ezekiel did not move. He lay there as still as the dead. Then, the shadow came. Eleanor's shadow, rising from the earth like mist. But she was not alone. Other shadows rose with her. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. They rose from the ground all around the grave, forming a circle. They stood silent, watching. And then, slowly, they began to sing. It was not a song Timothy recognized. It was something old, something from before words had meanings. A song of the earth itself, calling its children home. The shadows moved closer to the grave. They reached down with hands made of darkness, and they began to pull earth over Ezekiel. Not roughly, gently, almost tenderly. They covered him with soil, slowly, carefully, as if tucking a child into bed. Ezekiel did not resist. He did not move. He let himself be buried. Timothy wanted to scream, wanted to run forward and pull Ezekiel from the grave, but he could not move. He was paralyzed by the sight, by the terrible beauty of it. The shadows continued their work until Ezekiel was completely covered. Then they patted down the earth, smoothed the surface, and one by one, they sank back into the ground and disappeared. The prairie was silent again, empty, as if nothing had happened. Timothy waited until dawn. He was terrified that if he moved, the shadows would return and take him too. When the first light touched the horizon, he finally ran back to the settlement. He burst into the general store, found his mother, and gasped out what he had seen. Sarah Hendricks immediately gathered Tom Worthy, Dutch Mackenzie, and several others. They took shovels and rushed out to the prairie. They found the spot easily. The earth was freshly disturbed exactly as Timothy had described. They began to dig. The soil came away quickly. Within minutes, they had uncovered Ezekiel Marsh. He was lying exactly as Timothy had described, on his back, hands folded over his chest. But something was wrong. Ezekiel was not breathing. His skin was cold. He was dead, yet there was no sign of suffocation, no dirt in his mouth or nose. He looked peaceful, almost serene, as if he had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. They pulled his body from the ground. As they lifted him, something fell from his clasped hands. It was a small locket, tarnished silver, attached to a thin chain. Sarah opened it. Inside was a tiny portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a child with curls. Eleanor and Grace. Ezekiel had been holding them when he died. They buried Ezekiel Marsh in the settlement's small cemetery the next day. Reverend Kane performed the service. He spoke about forgiveness and mercy and the hope of resurrection. But Sarah Hendricks, standing by the grave with her son, wondered if Ezekiel had found forgiveness or if he had simply found an end. She wondered if Eleanor had come for him that night, if she had finally called him home, if they were together now somewhere beyond the veil of death. After the funeral, the settlement tried to return to normal, but things were not normal. People began to report strange occurrences. Tom Worthy said he heard digging at night, the sound of a shovel biting into earth, though when he investigated, he found nothing. Dutch Mackenzie said he saw shadows moving on the prairie at midnight, humanoid shapes that walked in circles and vanished when he approached. Sarah Hendricks woke several times to the sound of knocking. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, coming from the walls of her quarters. And Timothy Hendricks, the boy who had witnessed everything, began to have dreams. In his dreams, he was walking on the prairie. He was walking to a specific spot, a place that called to him. In his dreams, he carried a shovel. He began to dig. The hole grew deeper, and when he struck something solid, when he cleared away the earth and saw what lay beneath, he would wake screaming. A month after Ezekiel's death, Timothy told his mother about the dreams. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She asked him where on the prairie he was digging in these dreams. Timothy described the location. It was not where Ezekiel had been digging. It was a different spot, maybe 100 yards to the east. Sarah made a decision. She gathered several men from the settlement and told them what Timothy had described. They went out to the prairie, to the spot Timothy had indicated. They brought shovels. They began to dig. They did not have to dig deep. 3 feet down, they found bones. Human bones. But these were not old like the skull Ezekiel had found. These were relatively recent. The flesh had not yet completely rotted away. And wrapped around the bones was a dress, a woman's dress, torn and stained. They kept digging. They found more bones. A man, a child, an infant. 4 bodies in total, all buried in a shallow grave, all dead for perhaps a year, maybe less. They had been murdered. The skulls showed signs of trauma. They had been killed and dumped here, in this unmarked spot on the prairie, far from any settlement, far from any eyes. Sarah Hendricks felt her stomach turn. She understood now. This was why Ezekiel had been called to dig. This was why the shadows rose from the earth. This prairie was a graveyard. This land was soaked in death. How many others were buried here? How many murdered travelers? How many victims of violence? How many souls had been consigned to unmarked graves in this cursed ground? The settlement reported the discovery to the nearest marshal, who rode out 2 days later. He investigated but found no evidence of who the victims were or who had killed them. The bodies were too decomposed. There were no identifying marks, no possessions. They were reburied in the settlement cemetery with a simple marker that read, "Unknown, but not forgotten." But the strange occurrences did not stop. If anything, they increased. More people began to hear the digging at night. More people began to see the shadows on the prairie. And more people began to have the dreams. Dreams of walking to the prairie. Dreams of carrying a shovel. Dreams of digging. Timothy Hendricks was not the only one. Tom Worthy began to have the dreams. Dutch Mackenzie. Sarah Hendricks herself. One by one, members of the settlement found themselves compelled to go out to the prairie at night. They would wake in the morning with no memory of where they had been, but their hands would be dirty, their clothes would be covered in soil, and their bodies would ache as if they had spent hours engaged in hard labor. The settlement began to empty. Families packed their belongings and left, moving to other towns, other territories, anywhere but here. They could not stay in a place where the dead would not rest, where the earth itself seemed to be calling them to dig, to uncover, to disturb what had been hidden. By Christmas of 1852, only a handful of people remained. Sarah and Timothy Hendricks, Tom Worthy, old Jacob Fuller, and Reverend Kane, who had postponed his circuit riding, convinced that his spiritual intervention was still needed. They discussed what to do. Reverend Cain wanted to consecrate the prairie, to perform a ritual of purification, to drive out whatever malevolent force had taken hold of the land. But Sarah disagreed. She said they should not fight it. They should listen to it. The land was trying to tell them something. The dead were trying to tell them something. They needed to dig. They needed to uncover. They needed to give voice to the voiceless. On Christmas night, the 5 of them went out to the prairie together. They brought shovels, lanterns, and determination. They chose a spot at random and began to dig. They dug for hours, taking turns, working in shifts. 4 feet down, they found bones. They marked the spot and moved on. They chose another location and dug again. More bones. They kept digging. All through the night, they dug. By dawn, they had identified 7 separate graves, 7 clusters of bones, 7 sets of remains that had been hidden beneath the prairie grass. They spent the next week excavating. They uncovered 23 bodies in total. Men, women, children. Some had been dead for years, their bones yellowed and brittle. Others were more recent, still bearing traces of flesh and clothing. All of them had died violently. All of them had been buried without ceremony, without markers, without anyone to mourn them. Sarah Hendricks documented everything. She drew maps showing where each body had been found. She recorded what little information could be gleaned from the remains, descriptions of clothing, approximate ages, any identifying features. She wrote letters to marshals in 3 territories, describing what they had found, hoping someone might be able to identify the victims, hoping families might finally learn what had happened to their missing loved ones. Some of the bodies were eventually identified. A rancher who had disappeared 2 years earlier. A woman and her children who had vanished while traveling to California. A merchant who had left Austin for El Paso and never arrived. Each identification brought some small measure of closure, some small measure of justice. But many remained unknown. They were reburied in the settlement cemetery with a mass grave marker that read, "Here lie the forgotten of the Texas prairie. May they finally rest in peace." After the reburials, after the prayers and the tears and the long process of trying to return dignity to the dead, the strange occurrences stopped. The digging sounds ceased. The shadows on the prairie vanished. The dreams that had plagued the remaining settlers faded away. The land was quiet again. Sarah Hendricks stood at the mass grave one cold January morning and thought about Ezekiel Marsh. She wondered if he had known, somehow, what lay beneath that prairie. She wondered if his nightly digging had been his way of trying to uncover the truth, of trying to give voice to those who could no longer speak. She wondered if Eleanor's shadow had guided him, if the dead had called to him because they needed someone who understood grief, someone who understood guilt, someone who would not turn away from the hard work of bearing witness. She thought about how Ezekiel had said he was digging his own grave. In a way, he had been right. He had been preparing the ground for his own resting place, but in doing so, he had also prepared the way for others to find rest. His curse had become their salvation. His torment had become their release. Timothy Hendricks never forgot what he had seen that year. The shadows on the prairie, the woman made of darkness, the way Ezekiel had smiled before lying down in his grave. As he grew older, he would tell the story to his own children, and they would tell it to theirs. And the tale of the man who dug up his own grave every night and forgot by morning became part of the folklore of that part of Texas. The settlement itself did not survive much longer. By 1855, it was completely abandoned, its buildings left to rot under the merciless Texas sun. The general store collapsed in a windstorm. The blacksmith shop was claimed by rust and time. Even the small church, that building where people had gathered to sing hymns that never reached heaven, eventually fell in on itself, its wooden beams crumbling into dust. But the cemetery remained. The graves were still there, still marked, still tended by occasional travelers who passed through and felt compelled to stop, to pull weeds, to place stones, to pay respects to people they had never known. The mass grave marker stood for decades, its inscription slowly eroding but never completely disappearing. And Ezekiel Marsh's grave, with its simple headstone bearing only his name and the years of his birth and death, stood at the edge of the cemetery, positioned so that he faced south, toward the prairie where he had dug, where the forgotten had lain, where his final act of penance had been performed. There are those who say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind is still, you can still hear the sound of digging on that prairie. Not loud, not insistent, just a distant rhythm, metal striking earth, steady and patient. Some say it is Ezekiel, still performing his ritual, still unable to rest. Others say it is the earth itself, the land remembering what happened there, replaying the memory like an echo that will never fade. Sarah Hendricks left Texas in 1856, taking Timothy with her. They moved to Missouri, where she remarried and lived until her death in 1882. Timothy became a teacher. He lived a long life, dying in 1913 at the age of 73. But until the very end, he would sometimes wake in the night, convinced he heard 3 knocks on his bedroom wall. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. The pattern Eleanor had used to knock on her cabin door when she came home from the creek. The pattern that had haunted Ezekiel Marsh. The pattern that had become a bridge between the living and the dead. On his deathbed, Timothy told his daughter something he had never told anyone else. He told her that the night Ezekiel had been buried by the shadows, Timothy had not been hiding behind a mesquite tree. He had been standing right at the edge of the grave, watching. The shadows had known he was there. They had looked at him. And one of them, the one that had been Eleanor, had reached out with a hand made of darkness and touched his face. The touch had been cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, but it had not been malevolent. It had been grateful. She had been thanking him for bearing witness, thanking him for not looking away. His daughter asked him what it had felt like, that touch. Timothy thought for a long moment. Then he said it had felt like forgiveness, like being absolved of a sin he had not even known he was carrying. He said that after that touch, he had never feared death. He knew what waited on the other side, not judgment, not punishment, just the earth, receiving its children back, holding them close, remembering them forever. The prairie in Texas where all of this occurred is still there. It is empty land now, too remote to be of interest to developers, too barren to be of use to ranchers. The settlement cemetery is overgrown, the markers barely visible through the mesquite and prickly pear. But if you know where to look, you can still find Ezekiel Marsh's grave. And if you stand there at midnight, if you are very quiet and very still, you might hear something. A whisper carried on the wind, a rhythm like breathing, a sound like digging, far off in the dark, as if somewhere beneath your feet. Someone is still searching, still uncovering, still trying to bring the forgotten into the light. The land remembers, the earth remembers, and what is buried does not always stay buried. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it calls, sometimes it compels the living to dig, to uncover, to bear witness, because the dead do not rest until they are remembered, and some graves are not meant to stay closed. Some graves are meant to be opened again and again, each time revealing a little more truth, a little more sorrow, a little more of the price we pay for turning away from what we cannot bear to see. Ezekiel Marsh understood this. He understood that his nightly digging was not a curse but a calling. He understood that his forgetting by morning was not a mercy but a test, a challenge to see if he would continue to do the work even without knowing why. And in the end, when he lay down in that grave and let the shadows cover him, he understood that he had passed the test. He had done what was needed. He had dug until the truth was uncovered. And now, finally, he could rest. But the work is never truly finished. There are always more graves to dig, more forgotten to remember, more truths buried beneath the surface of things. And there are always those who are called to do the work, whether they remember it in the morning or not. The compulsion rises from the earth itself, from the bones beneath the soil, from the endless patience of death waiting for the living to acknowledge what has been lost. In the end, we are all digging our own graves. Some of us know it, some of us do it in our sleep, but we are all moving toward that final hole in the ground, that place where the earth will receive us back and hold us until the end of time. The only question is what we uncover along the way, what truths we bring into the light, what forgotten souls we give voice to before we ourselves are forgotten. Ezekiel Marsh dug his grave every night for months and forgot by morning, but the prairie remembered, the earth remembered, and that, in the end, is what matters. Not that we remember, but that we are remembered. Not that we know what we are doing, but that we do it anyway. Not that we understand our purpose, but that we fulfill it nonetheless. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some graves were never meant to be opened, but the cursed frontier demands crossing. The graves demand opening, and those who are called to do the work have no choice but to answer, even if they forget by morning, even if they never understand why, even if the only reward is to finally lie down in the earth themselves and let the shadows cover them with soil and darkness, and the deep, endless peace of being received back into the ground, from which all things come, and to which all things must eventually return. The man who dug up his own grave every night and forgot by morning is gone now, but the prairie remains, and on certain nights, the digging continues, not by human hands, but by something older, something that remembers when humans forget, something that will continue the work long after the last person has left this land, long after the settlements have crumbled to dust, long after even the cemetery markers have eroded into illegibility. The earth itself will dig. The earth itself will remember. And the earth itself will bear witness to what was buried and what must be uncovered before the final darkness claims us all.